This talk contains comparisons with React and also includes notable reasons why Vue is a great framework to use. I'll talk a little bit about Vue 2 and 3 and the current ecosystem. We're on a journey at the moment to move to Vue 3, and there's still a long way to go. I'll touch briefly upon getting started with Vue.js in terms of very specific kind of things you can do. And yeah, and this talk does contain opinions, my opinions, for sure. What this talk doesn't contain, I simply don't have the time to go into the basics of JavaScript frameworks and kind of where they're useful and kind of how best to use them. I also don't have a huge amount of code examples here. Obviously, I'm very fortunate that my counterpart is doing a very code-related presentation, so hopefully all the pressure, he has all the pressure of that and I don't have any, which is good for me. Yeah, I don't go too much into server-side rendering as well for that reason. And yeah, and you know, my talk isn't 100% praising of Vue, because there are areas which I think could be improved. Just before I start, just on a very surface level, I think it's worth just saying about a JavaScript framework that you know, my interpretation of a good JavaScript framework is that it provides a structure to build your project on, and it will make certain decisions for you around things like data reactivity. So reactivity is ultimately why we want to use JavaScript frameworks. You know, for example, we want to get data, display it. The data might change, and then the framework will react to that change. We don't want to build, you know, the code for that. We want to kind of pass that to Vue and the like. Of course, it's worth pointing out, obviously, I'm going to talk about React. There are many other frameworks. You know, there are no wrong answers here. But ultimately, your choice of framework, you know, really is based on your team skill set, priorities, and obviously things like documentation. I'm very happy to discuss and take questions after the talk. So yeah, just very briefly about myself. I'm a front-end consultant. I won't bore you with the list of people I've worked with, but I've been working now for 15 years. In just you know, being completely transparent in the open, my day rate is roughly around £450 a day. That is what I've kind of been taking for Vue projects. Obviously, we live in strange times right now in terms of obviously everyone's remote by default, so the rates are fluctuating, but that's kind of where I sit for reference. And then yeah, I've just briefly composed. This is my last 5 years of development, what I've spent my time on. So the majority is absolutely Vue. But yeah, I've also spent time with React and Angular. So yeah, so let's talk about React. I appreciate this is a Vue talk, but there's no point talking about Vue in isolation. React is the market leader, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. React is great. You know, it's a fantastic framework. JSX is really great. Statewide revalidating is something I'm using at the moment. Is incredible to essentially mutate data before you actually receive the data, which is just incredible, and for performance is amazing. And obviously the contract and perm market for React is incredible right now. But there are some downsides to React. React is very much by Facebook for Facebook. They very much roadmap in the dark. We don't really know what the future of React is going to be. We don't really know how Facebook treats React in terms of the business. We know there's a small core team, but we don't know how long they will be sustained and how long they'll be supported in Facebook. And we've had this in the past where the community's vision is different to Facebook's vision, for example, very notably with the patent problem of about 2 years ago, I think it was now, where essentially Facebook wanted to patent certain aspects of React, and yeah, and that was a difficult time for everyone involved. Vue, how does Vue differ? Vue is community driven. It is by far the largest independent JavaScript framework, which I think is incredible. It's very much in the open, and the roadmaps are very clear. It is very much for the community, and the photo on the right demonstrates how it's backed. It's backed financially by amazing companies and individuals who give their money. Of course, there is a financial risk to that, or potential financial risk, if things change, the economy changes. We've seen this with Babel recently, where Babel is incredibly well supported, but is essentially running out of money. It's only fair for transparency to mention it. Also as well, talk about. I'm not sure I understand. Thanks, Siri. Talking about React as well. React has a great path to build mobile hybrid apps. Vue 3 has Ionic, as does React, and I'm personally a huge fan of Ionic. I use it quite a lot, but React Native's libraries, are second to none. There's a lot of things which are officially supported libraries, whereas something like Ionic is very much kind of community wrappers around kind of existing libraries, which may or may not be supported. Vue does have mobile options here. It has, for example, Vue Native, but they're so early. They're so early and kind of in their infancy. I wouldn't actively recommend them. So I feel like this matters if you have a small development team and mobile is an option, in the sense of, you don't have the staff, potentially the dedicated mobile staff, it's something to keep an eye on. However, Vue has a much clearer ecosystem. I call it kind of batteries included, optional batteries included. With things like state management, routing, static site generation, it's much clearer what to use with Vue. For me as an individual, I don't really want to waste my time making decisions about front-end architecture, in the sense of what libraries should I be using. So for example, React, if you talk about state management, has Redux, MobX, Recoil, hooks themselves. There's many different frameworks, whereas as we see here, if you want to use Vue, you'll start at the top. If you just need to simply have reactivity, you can just use Vue in isolation, which is fantastic. For example, that's a good use case for if you may have kind of a typical MVC type backend where you don't have single page app support. You've kind of got that traditional backend structure where you have kind of pages. You may just want to put discrete little apps of functionality, or kind of micro apps of functionality. But if you want to move beyond that, your decision's made for you, in the sense of you use Vue Router and Vue Meta for the page metadata, and you'll have an SPA there. State management, of course, it's a big thing. I'll put that aside for a second, but we'll come back to it. If you, as a developer, if you want to learn Vue, if you pick these top 4 things, this is pretty much the entirety of the stack. You'll be able to pick up the vast majority of projects easily, because there isn't that much variance in the ecosystem, which I personally really enjoy. Of course, there are kind of supplementary libraries you can use. So for example, Vuetify is a fantastic UI framework. There's also things like Axios, which is obviously a bit more generic across frameworks, but if you want to do API requests, you can use things like that. There's also Vue.js. Sorry, excuse my typo there. There's also Vue.js for form validation, and Vue for internalization. Of course, there's Nux as well, which we'll talk about later on. This stack is very solid. This will take all of your functionality quite easily. And yeah, and just to jump back to Vuex there, what the nice thing about it is, if you want state management, you'll use Vuex. That's great. But what I would say as a general piece of advice for people starting out is don't put in Vuex by default. Absolutely start your app development and start your app. You'll know when you need to use state management. Essentially, if you're doing a lot of property traversal, if you're passing data backwards and forwards to components, anything which is, for example, more than one level deep. So if you've got like a parent page, maybe a component and a component within that, that's probably the time where Vuex becomes important. And also as well, on that note, don't put everything into state by default. Vuex works best when it's absolutely minimal. But yeah, just to carry on with that, when you're making the decision about, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but just before you move on from that, Simeon has a great question. Does Vue have a pre-built template system, a bit like Create React App?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So I touched briefly upon this later on, but there are essentially two boilerplates you can use. There's Vue CLI, which is fantastic. It will include everything you need to get running. It gives you many different options as well. So for example, you can say you want to include Vuex or for example, TypeScript. It's really simplistic to get going with. It's essentially installing Vue CLI globally and then running a command. There is another option as well, which I'll talk about later on, using Vite. Vite is very new. It's a new way of bundling JavaScript, and Vite is incredible. I won't go too much into it now, just because I've got a slide on it later. But there are absolutely options to get going very quickly. I would say, personally, arguably superior to Create React App, because it allows much more flexibility. Vue CLI, for example, because you can customize the config quite easily without ejecting the app, for example. But yeah, if that's okay, I'll just carry on, because obviously I'm conscious of time as well. When making a decision about any framework, including Vue, don't worry about framework benchmarking, don't worry about synthetic benchmarks. React, Vue, Angular, so well optimized at this point. There's no point directly comparing them against each other because they're so well optimized. Time to interactive it should be your key metric. But for example, if you put many different ad trackers or analytics providers in, then any sort of kind of micro optimization advantage you have from certain frameworks will be lost. And yeah, and a little bit blunter with that, I'm afraid. If your app is slow, it's probably 99.9% your fault. It's not going to be the framework's fault. I'm sorry to say that. If you want to start out in Vue, absolutely have time to experiment and do trial and error in terms of like component architecture and the like. I've been involved in replatforming projects which were because of speed, a lack of speed, but ultimately the real issues are typically kind of lack of training, kind of lack of course budget, tutorial budget, and kind of just not enough time to get used to the frameworks. However, if you've come from React, use both. Why don't you use JSX? JSX is a wonderful templating language to essentially write your HTML in JavaScript. You could absolutely use JSX in Vue, especially for Vue 3. But be warned about this, because one of Vue's strengths is its separation of concerns, that you have a dedicated template block, dedicated style block, and dedicated logic block. So it's a really interesting time to be interested in Vue. I've been very fortunate to use Vue 2 for a number of years now, and kind of my world's been turned upside down by the composition API, which is being introduced. I was very all the talk about Vue 3 is dominated by the composition API, which we'll briefly go into now. But yeah, so when we talk about Vue 2 and Vue 3, Vue 3 is absolutely ready to use now. As a core product, it is ready to go. It is fantastic, but the ecosystem around it is very much a work in progress. So just to explain this a little bit more, Vue 3 has been updated with a new version of Vuex, which fully supports Vue 3. Same with Vue Router, which is great. But for example, Vue Meta, which I mentioned before about metadata, is in alpha, and that is pretty much the where we're at the moment, where you can use the core Vue product really well, but the ecosystem, you're probably going to be using alpha and beta, maybe release candidate products, and you've just got to be mindful of that. So yeah, Vue 3 is all about the composition API. There are, of course, other improvements with Vue 3, such as improved TypeScript support, but ultimately, yeah, when you move to Vue 3, you're moving to the composition API. You can still use the options API, which is the V2 way of doing things. That is absolutely fully supported in Vue 3, but who knows how long that will be supported alongside. So I'm gonna do a little bit of a code dive here for the composition API. So this wonderful example is taken from the Vue official Vue documentation. So this component on the left is a view to show the list of repositories of a certain user. And it also applies some searching and filtering. This code doesn't show the actual templating or styling, just for the purposes of time. So a couple of differences from Vue 2 here is the usage of setup. Setup is essentially a function which is the first thing which runs. So even if you're new to Vue 3 or coming from Vue 2, setup is your baseline. This, as a Vue 2 equivalent, this runs before created. And this is where essentially you put your boilerplate in for a component. Something different for Vue 3, which is important to note, is the usage of refs. So if we look to the right of the screen, we look at the top right, which is composable. So we can see that there's a ref here, and what this ref is doing, this is saying that this piece of data, it could be an array, could be an object, doesn't matter, but this is going to be reactive. So what that means is that this data can change, and that's important for the app to know that that data has changed. So to use this example, this function is getting the user repositories. So we have our repositories, which is a blank array, which is again being made reactive. We have a function to get the data. And what's interesting here as well is that we see where the life cycle has changed from Vue 2, where it's kind of new for, and where if you're new to Vue, where kind of one of the main kind of almost functions of Vue, where you can say on various different life cycles what to do. So for example, on mounted is when this component is first included onto a page. So what's happening here? So this component this composable, I should say, apologies, has no understanding of where it is in the app. It doesn't need to understand where it is. Its only purpose here is to pass repository data. So what you're saying here is whenever this composable is used in the app for the first time, I want you to get the user repositories. So what it's also showing as well here is when the parent data changes, I want you to get the user repositories again. So what's happening here is user is typically an ID in this case, which is going to be passed into the component. If that user ID changes, so for example, if you go to another page or to another user, automatically View is smart enough to know that the user's changed, I need to get new data and pass that back to the parent. So for example, if you have like a drop down of users and you change that on the parent, this will change. This is a textbook example of reactivity. And yeah, and it's really cool. So you'll notice very quickly that, yeah, so we're using this use user repositories composable. But what's great is because we're still in this setup phase, we can now filter that data before the user sees anything. So we're now using the repository name search, which is simply matching repositories to whatever the user's search term was. I appreciate this is a very short, shallow dive into the code, but it's what I'm trying to demonstrate here is how much you can do, how reusable you can make your code with Vue 3. You can definitely do this with Vue 2, but very much with the composition API, how reusable the code is, and how clean that code is. So what we see here is that essentially the data has been received, the repository data, and it's now being filtered, and then it's then returned essentially to the template and rendered. So incredibly quick, incredibly reactive, really nice. It's worth pointing out at this point, it's perfectly fine to use Vue 2. It's actually perfectly fine to choose Vue 2 now. There's some very good reasons why you should use Vue 2 at this point. Vue 2 is actually getting a new version, 2.7, with some of the backported improvements from Vue 3, and you can actually use the composition API in Vue 2. So I'm going to just do some quick decisions here about, because it may be, because we're in this transition period of which framework to use. So brand new project, and you're going to build a bespoke UI, not going to use a UI framework, I would absolutely say use Vue 3. Vue 3 is the future. You can use the options I if you really wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend that for a new project. Absolutely go with Vue 3. Do you need to use a UI framework? This is where it gets a little bit more complicated. I would recommend at this time to use Vue 2 with the composition API. The reason why I say that is Vuetify is probably the main UI framework. It's a great framework. I use it a lot myself. Vuetify 3 is in development, but it's in alpha at this point. And in terms of debugging issues, my experience tells me that UI is where you'll get a lot of your issues. So if you're working with an alpha framework, it is very much, at your own risk. So I would probably say if you need a UI framework, use Vue 2, but use the composition API now. So then when your framework is ready to move to Vue 3, you can move to Vue 3 with little issues. Or using Vue 2, for example, an existing project. Could go either way with this one. There is a migration build on its way, which will, when you run that build, it will tell you things you'll need to change for Vue 3. That isn't here yet. There's also considerations. Do you use TypeScript? You may want to simplify your code base by moving to the composition API, which has a much improved support for TypeScript. But the great thing is, with Vue 3, that it still supports the options API. You could do it piecemeal, maybe for example drawing component refactors, but ultimately that decision is yours. IE11 support. You're on Vue 2 forever, unfortunately. Obviously, my point would be, do you really need to do this? IE11 is end of support this year, finally. You know, I would suggest looking at alternatives. You know, can you sandbox an app? Could you produce like a light version for IE11? But ultimately, if you need to support IE11, you need to pick stability. So stick with the options API, stick with Vue 2. Want to use Next.js? I will let Daniel talk about that in more detail. And then, yeah, and then just a quick thing about getting started. You can use Vue CLI or Vite, as I previously mentioned. Vite is fast. It is so incredibly fast. It is unreal. Vite is a smaller package than Vue CLI. Vue CLI contains a lot. It's really customizable. You can, there's also a great ecosystem for Vue CLI itself to, for example, include Sentry. Error monitoring, for example, is something I use Vue CLI for. But Vite is great. Vue CLI supports Vue 2 or 3, so you can use Vue CLI as a baseline to experiment with, whereas Vite officially at this point just supports Vue 3 at the moment. And then, yeah, just to use Vite as an example, you can, assuming you have Node 12 or 14 LTS installed, you can run that command, don't need to install anything else, and that will produce a Vue 3 app for you. And a template ready to go. And then, yeah, so to summarize, Vue is incredibly scalable. You can go from just, you know, small micro apps within bigger pages, all the way up to single page apps, all the way to server-side rendering. It's a fantastic framework. Vue takes away a lot of the decision processes around front-end architecture because it has such a tight ecosystem. You know, you'll pick Vuex state management, and that's kind of the end of the conversation. I would suggest to use Vue 3 if possible at this point. But if you can't, use the composition API in Vue 2. And then finally, just in terms of resource, I cannot stress enough how Vue School or Vue Mastery are incredible. They have great resources from working with Vue 2, working with Vue 3, TypeScript, workflows, everything I don't have time to talk about. And that's me. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. I'm more than happy to take questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Phil. We had a question from Simeon in the chat asking about other APIs that are being supported. So stuff like Vue Router, Vuex, that sort of thing. Is that how well have they been migrated to Vue 3?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Vue Router and Vuex have full support for Vue 3 now. They've both been updated. Vuex is an interesting one because they have done essentially a one-to-one migration to Vue 3. So if you know the Vuex API, it hasn't changed fundamentally. There are for Vuex 5, there's talk about making breaking changes and streamlining the API, which I think will be really exciting because one of the things that will do is bring much improved TypeScript support. So yeah, absolutely, Vuex are ready to go right now. Cool.
Yeah, it's really, I knew that there was some thorniness around migrating from Vue 2 to Vue 3, but it was great to get an explanation for why that is. And it's fascinating to hear that whereas sort of Vue 3 is really ready to go, like it's this surrounding ecosystem, that's not quite there, and it makes it a tricky decision. Thanks for your decision tree. That helped clarify what we should use and when. But yeah, does anyone else want to? Yeah, sorry, go on, Phil.
No, I was just going to say very quickly. You know, the community ecosystem has kind of used this time to essentially do a lot of refactoring. So it's like we'll move to the composition API, or actually we'll, you know, refactor our kind of plugin or, you know, module now, which is great. It's absolutely great, but obviously there is that latency between Vue 3 essentially being finalized and the ecosystem, and ultimately it's you know, you have to kind of bring in your own risk.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Cool. Got a question from James Cowan. Can both View 2 and View 3 be used without a build step like Webpack?
Yes, both solutions completely support you just pulling in, for example, a script from the web. Code Sandbox as well, for example, you can use just for quick, rapid kind of R&D and prototyping. But yeah, absolutely, you can just pull in script tag View 3 or View 2, and it will work fine. Same with Vuex and Vue as well.
Cool. And one more question from Furkan before we move on. Can you use Nuxt with Vue 3? Maybe this is something that will come from Daniel, but do you know about that?
I do know. So I don't know the full extent of it, and Daniel will be much better placed for it, but I know that you can use Nuxt. I've been working with React lately. I'm sorry. You can use Nuxt with the composition API. They have a plugin for that, which is great. And Nuxt 3 is on its way, which has full Vue 3 support.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Phil. Big round of applause. That, again, you can't really hear, unfortunately, but the love is there. We're going to move on now. Now we have a good general overview of Vue and how it works. We're going to move on to Daniel Rowe, and he's going to talk to us about Nuxt.js. So please give Daniel a big welcome. I can see the emojis popping up. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much. Hey everyone, it's amazing to be virtually in Brighton, and that's pretty cool for me. I'm up in the Northeast, so obviously Brighton is only a dream. We can only imagine here in the Northeast the wonderful sunshine, the beaches, all of that, and I feel somehow I'm closer to it. So thanks for inviting me. Please interrupt me. Drop questions in, and Alistair, just please do. Doesn't matter what I'm saying; it can't be that interesting. If someone has a question, just fire it at me. Be quite fun. Before we get started, and I share my screen and we just dive into the code, could I have an idea how many people have used Vue before? Just in the chat, you could say something, or you could. Okay, so a few people. And if anyone's used Nuxt before in particular, if you could just sort of type Nuxt or something like that. Does Next count? Absolutely. Absolutely not. The power of a single letter. Next is great though, but it's not the same as Nuxt. That's really helpful. That's really good to know. So we'll be coming from all kinds of different backgrounds. Let me dive straight in, share my screen. And from now on, you are invisible to me. Only Alistair can convey your messages to me. So great. Let's dive into Nuxt. Now, what I should say as we get started with Nuxt is, what is it? So if Vue.js is a framework for JavaScript, Nuxt is a framework for Vue. So it exists to make the lives of developers who are using Vue easier and simpler. So Nuxt calls itself a progressive framework, which means that you don't need to know anything to get started. So it should just work from the first moment. And as you do more things or need more customization, you should be able to do that. It should be entirely within your grasp. So we're going to start just in exactly that kind of way with nothing. So I'm going to create a folder, call it Async. And we'll create a blank Git repo, and we'll create a blank package.json, and I'll fire that up. So I trust it. Absolutely, I trust it. So what we're going to do with this folder is just add a single dependency, Nuxt. And what that's going to do, say again?
You've used an alias there. What is C dot?
I've just aliased that to my Visual Studio Code instance.
Oh, code, right. Okay.
And the dot is the current directory.
Sure.
So it will just open that up. Okay, great. We've installed Nuxt, so I can actually just start it now. So if I run yarn Nuxt, that will just fire it up. We've got nothing, so there's nothing really to show. But what it does is it fires up a dev server, which is on, in this case, on localhost 3000. And you can see we've got a blank, empty page. If at any point you want to start a Nuxt project, by the way, with a little bit more than this, 3 ways. One is you can fire a web-based project. If you go to template.nuxtjs.org, you can create a Nuxt project in Code Sandbox that will fire up a bit fuller Nuxt project with lots of directories and files, all of which I'm going to explain this evening. If you want to do that in your browser, you can do that. There's a similar one, StackBlitz has a Nuxt start as well. StackBlitz is pretty cool. It actually runs entirely in your browser in WebAssembly code, your entire node environment. So that's just downloaded Nuxt and started it up super fast. So happy to talk about that later if you want, but here we go. This is a blank Nuxt project with no installations, with nothing there. So initially, the way everything works for Nuxt is that you have a folder called Pages. And in this folder called Pages, you can stick all of your routes, all the pages you want to visit. So we'll start with an index.view, and we will stick a blank view component. And if I save that, you'll see it detects that it's now there. This is all hot module reloading, except that on this occasion, I will just refresh the page to start with, because it's the first thing. From this point onward, I can save something and it will automatically appear on the page. Doesn't look very nice though at the moment because I've got no CSS. Now you'll see what's happening. If I have a look at the source, you'll see that we actually have HTML being served up. So one of the things that people often think about when they think of Nuxt is the fact that it's a server-side rendering framework. It doesn't have to be. It can produce SPA, but it does produce HTML if you want, and that's what it does out of the box, which is great for SEO or for other situations where you need that super fast initial response. So the moment the HTML arrives in your browser, the browser can start downloading the necessary scripts to render the page, or add interactivity rather. It can also start rendering the page with CSS. You'll see that all the CSS we need to render the page is already inlined in it. And obviously, there's no gap, no loader, no white screen before anything starts happening. So the code is just there to start with. We can customize pretty much all of that. So if I were to create a new file, we'll create a Nuxt config file, nuxtconfig.js. And we'll just do a couple of tiny, I'll just configure the default headers, the head tags of this Nuxt.js app. We'll add a link, and this is going to be a style sheet, and we'll give it just something that looks a little bit nicer than my default page. There we go. That looks a bit better. Okay, so now with Nuxt, as you want to build out your app, you just create pages. So if I want an about page, I'll create an about page here. Stick some stuff in there, that's about. And if I go to my browser and visit about, you'll see my about page works. So this is basically a seamless integration with View Router, which obviously we've heard mentioned already. This means you don't need to set it up. Each page you have in your app in this pages directory is automatically bundle split. So the code necessary to render that page in the browser and add interactivity is separated out when you actually build your app, so that as your app gets bigger and your pages grow, you don't suffer any loss of performance.
Daniel, just quickly, we've had a lot of love for the font that you're using. What is that font?
I'm using Dank Mono.
Dank Mono. Okay.
Dank, I think you can find it at dank.sh.
Okay. Oh, very cool.
I promise I'm not a salesman for them, but yeah, I like it.
And sorry, can you just show the CSS? Was it newcss.com/light?
Yes, newcss.net /light.css.
Sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
Okay, so yes, so we've got our about page, and everything that's needed for that page, components and things, can be bundle split. We can create some more special folders in here, but before we do, you might be wondering what this .nuxt folder is. This is basically the app that Nuxt builds for you. If you have a look in there, it's not Git committed, by the way. It's purely dynamic. It's generated just for my dev server, and if I were to build the app, it would do something similar. But you can see all of the JavaScript that you might normally add, all the boilerplate that you might need for a normal View.js app. And basically, Nuxt takes care of all of that for you. It generates that based on what you need. So for example, here's the router code. We are importing the router, we're Vue using it, we're creating a list of routes. We have some, they're all lazy loaded. You see that we've got some dynamic imports there, and we've got some more configuration. And that's true for every page in that directory. If you ever want to see how much Nuxt is doing for you, that directory is a good place to start. Nuxt does a number of other things that might be quite useful. So you might want a layout, for example. You can simply create a page and say, this is my clever Nuxt app. And then actually we just add a Nuxt element. And now this default layout is going to be wrapped around every page in my app. I can do the same with other pages. So I can basically create more layouts. And basically, I could create something called admin, and then have an admin layout, which would enable me to add some extra admin styles or something like that. You can also create a folder called store, which will enable Vuex. So Vuex is state management. If you've been using Redux or something like that, it will be quite similar. And just by creating this file, we automatically configure Vuex and enable it in our Nuxt project. So we could simply say export const state is, and we export a function because Nuxt runs on the server side, so it's important not to share the object between requests. Don't worry, that is spelled out in both the Vuex and the Nuxt docs. But we might say, give us some state to start with. And that's all you need to do to configure Vuex. You might also want things like actions. And you can do all your normal actions. There's a special one for Nuxt called Nuxt server init, which runs every time a request comes in. You can do some stuff to set up your app. Maybe an initial request to an API that you need to make, maybe to verify or authenticate the user, stuff like that. And then there's some other folders that are more convention rather than necessity. So you can, for example, if you need to integrate a library, like maybe you have Google Analytics, or you might want to use Vue Ally or something like that, you can create a plugin. So we can create a plugin, just call it test, and that will just export a function, and I can do things in that function which run every request. So that might be something like I might import Vue, and I might then import I haven't installed this, but you might do something like this. And that's a way of basically automatically getting some pretty cool integrations. All I'd need to do to make that work is simply add that plugin to my plugins array in Nuxt config. and it would be set up. There we go. So if we are wanting to make pages that are slightly more, or routes that are slightly more complex than the ones we have, we can create parent routes with children. So for example, we might have a file called, we'll change about to to-dos, and then we might have a directory which has an individual to-do, and we want to be able to render this for with some wrapper text. So here we can have a list of to-dos. We could then have a Nuxt child component. And if we then, in this dynamic page, display a single to-do, then Nuxt would automatically make that into the router configuration that Vue requires in order to have a parent route with a child. So that if you visit that, that slug to-dos / anything you like, it's going to render the parent and the child. And in the child, we're going to be able to access the ID, the dynamic ID, with something like this root params ID automatically. It's really cool.
So that JSON that you just showed in the .nuxt file, that was created automatically?
Yes, this is Lily, by the way.
Hello, Lily.
She is naturally very interested in the Vue router. Yes, so this is created automatically whenever I save anything or do anything. It's created by the dev server right now, and it's used by the dev server to render my Vue app. So if you were wanting to explore, you could open app.js. You could see what the root Vue application is. You could see some of the clever helper functions that Nuxt has for you. I don't want to dive in too deep because you can get very deep. There's a lot of stuff that Nuxt does under the hood to set everything up and just make it work. But yes, that's all happening in this .nuxt folder. You don't need to know anything about it, but it is there. But since you've asked about how that works, actually our app will not work because we now do not have Vue ally. If you want to see how you might actually go about doing more than just developing with a Nuxt app, you'll want to do you'll want to add one or two scripts to your package JSON, because Nuxt can do quite a lot of interesting things. So obviously we have our development script, which is just running Nuxt. We can also generate a static site. So if I were to, this is really useful, particularly with providers like Versal or Netlify, who have generous free tiers and allow you to deploy something very easily. If I have a static target, I can simply run Nuxt generate, and what it will do is it will run the Webpack build for me, optimize all my code, and then visit every route in my site and pre-render it for me. So it's run a Webpack build here, and then it's generated these routes. It's created this dist folder with my index.html, a fallback HTML, which I can serve for any unknown page, like a dynamic route. You typically just need to configure that in your hosting provider. And then all the JavaScript that you require. And it has some other cool features too. But basically that's all done for you automatically, and that can just then be dropped up for a server rendered type experience, but without a server. You can also start a, you run a builds and a start command. You'll want to run those one after the other. You can generate a built version of your site that's optimized for production, and then just fire up a server that serves that and handles each request as it comes in. That would be incredibly simple to do. that would be the website. It's running with low memory usage, but it won't have any hard module reload or anything like that. Now, Nuxt is not just a front-end framework, but it also lets you do lots of other things too. So, for example, I might want an API. So, we'll create a to-do API. I can create a normal connect style, express style middleware. So something like, what will I do? I'll return if anyone wants to correct my memory, then feel free to do that. I think that should do the trick, don't you think? And I can then just add a something called server middleware in my Nuxt config. This will actually just add a server endpoint to my front-end application. And one of the things about Nuxt that is so useful, is that it runs in multiple environments. So with an SPA, that only runs in the browser. But Nuxt runs in more places than the browser. And this is typically described by the adjective isomorphic. So it's meant to run using the same code in more than one place. So it runs on your Node server, and it also runs in your browser. And actually, with the work we've been doing for Nuxt 3, we have a new rendering engine called Nitro, which is actually going to be backported so people can use it in Nuxt 2. It runs everywhere, including it can run the server-side code in web workers, on Cloudflare workers, even on Dino, places without a typical Node server. So, but server middleware basically allows you to hook into this feature. So you could do things within a Nuxt app that can only be done on a server, such as use private keys or config that you don't want to expose to your end client. Or you might access the file system, including writing stuff to the file system. And it's all quite seamless. So in this case, we'll actually use a slight shorthand and just say our path is going to be API to-dos, and we want that to be handled with API to-dos.js. And now if I've done that correctly, I should be able to hit API to-dos. Yep, and I'm getting back exactly the object that I want. In my Nuxt app, I might consume that in lots of different ways. There's a special Nuxt hook called fetch, which allows you to hook into server prefetching, which is a relatively new feature of Vue. So imagine I have something called to-dos there, and I want to fetch it. So this to-dos, I'll make it async, is await fetch, not this fetch. What am I going to fetch? This to-dos, right? And right, I think that should work for me. And then maybe let's display the list of to-dos, right? So before, oh no, it's not. I created a terrible, let's make this an array. So we're going to get an array back. So we're going to want to-do and to-dos. Key is going to be to-do. Sorry, this is just boilerplate Vue. And we're just going to print to-do.test. So what we want is to fetch actual endpoint. This is right. There we go. So we now have an array being fetched on the server, and that will also be the same if I navigate on the client side. So for example, if I'm here on this to-dos page, which bears no resemblance whatsoever to any sort of functional to-do app, we can actually create something called a Nuxt link, which is a Vue router link with more features to the home page. So, for example, it will prefetch the JavaScript that's required to render that page when the link comes into the viewport. So we could go home, and what we would find if we did that would be that we're going to render the home page, and almost instantaneously that data is going to be fetched. Now, here's the cool thing. We're in a dev server, and we're just we're playing around with this. If we were to generate our package this way, so effectively we have a little API that we've created, and we could swap that out for some paid API that you've got, your CMS or something. We can actually generate our app. And because I've selected a static target, it's actually going to run that query in advance for me, create a payload file with the results of that query. And now, as I navigate through the pages of my app, it's not going to fetch, it's not going to call my API anymore. It's actually going to call my stored payload file, and it's going to produce something for me, which is, which has all of my, oh, I was unable to fetch it. It's my own fault. Let's do this, something else. It's actually going to do that for me. So as I navigate through the app, I'm able to access that without incurring extra API costs or limits. That's an incredibly powerful tool. It's not suitable for every use case, but if it is, then the static target option is likely what you want. There we go. That's the result of my API call. Now Typicode is giving that back to me. But that isn't all. So there's other stuff I could say in terms of the directory structure. So we've got a static folder where you can just put files you want to be served up directly, like your favicon or robots text. But one of the most powerful features of Nuxt is its module support. So if you were to go to modules.nuxtjs.org, you'll see a list of modules. These are tools that integrate with Nuxt. So whether that's you need to add progressive web app support with a manifest and generating icons for different devices, or whether you want to add TypeScript support, or whether you want to add Tailwind CSS or Vuetify or Axios or I18N support, or whether you want to add the composition API or an integration with a favorite CMS or whatever. It's all really extensible. So not only could you pull in any of these, some of which are sort of first party, created by Nuxt maintainers, others of which are out in the community, you can also create your own modules pretty easily and hook into every aspect of Nuxt. So you can make it entirely yours. And this is a very powerful way to extend Nuxt or add functionality to it. I see there's some questions coming in. Alistair, is there anything I should know before I carry on?
No, not right now. I've asked all the sort of more pertinent ones at the moment.
Okay, great. So what we might want to do with an app like this is, say, install the composition API, which we've already talked about in terms of Vue 3. Now, Nuxt 3 is just around the corner, by the way. It's probably will see a public beta sometime in the next month, which is going to be pretty exciting. But you can experiment with the composition API already. So here's how you would install a module, and this would be true for any kind of module, whether it's Axios or the composition API or TypeScript. You're simply going to add it. Most of them are dev modules, which means they can be run at build time only, and that's by far the best option. Simply going to paste that. And then all we need to do is add it to our build modules in our Nuxt config. In this case, it is. Okay. And now we can write in this new syntax that we were shown earlier. So actually now, instead of using data, for example, we could make this whole thing setup function. And we might pull in ref, a defined component, which is a new way of type hinting the shape of a view component. So it gives you useful data. And this would be a sort of way of doing that in the composition API. So that's not going to print anything because we haven't filled it, but it is running just as you might expect. So there are other cool integrations. So there's something called Nuxt image, which we've only just released this last week, and I'll show you that. And there's something else called Nuxt content, which you might have come across before. I'll install those both at the same time. So Nuxt image is a built-in a drop-in replacement for the normal image component that takes a lot of the hard work out of optimizing images for you. So it will generate source sets based on the data you provide, and it has built-in providers for some of the services you might use, like Cloudinary or ImageX or others. There's even a sort of self-hosted version that will transform your images on the fly from a massive source image to something that's much smaller. We're going to create an assets directory, and we're going to pop some images into that. Okay. And we have something called random, which we'll call image1. Is that a ping? It's a JPEG. And we'll do the same for image. Let's just make sure that they're beautiful. Okay, so now if we want to configure Nuxt image, it's exactly the same really as any other build module. Do check the docs for these kind of things if you're using them. Oh, and I should probably stop. Server once more. And in our index page, we might want to, for example, display one of these images. So we'll have something like a Nuxt image, and we actually will stick those in a static directory. So we can just access it with /image1.jpg. And we should see now our image. And if we are inspecting that, you'll see it's our full-sized image. If we want to have a width, say, of 200, we can do that. And now we have not just has the image width changed, but in fact, the actual size of the image has changed as well to optimize that. The great thing about that is if we're, say, generating a static site, we can do this at generate time rather than on demand. But if you're using a service like Cloudinary or self-hosted IPX, we can actually do this on runtime as well. If we wanted to produce some sizes, so if we wanted to say at medium size, this should be 250 px, and at large, let's make it 500. Then that will actually produce an array of sizes and source set for us, with all the different some different possible options based on the default config for Nuxt image, which means your browser can pick the one that's most relevant for you. Right, I'm probably boring you with Nuxt image. There's lots of cool features that it offers, and these are super important if you're wanting to pursue that 100 Lighthouse score. Another feature, the other module that we installed, which I mentioned, is called Nuxt content. And that is basically if you want to build a blog, for example, or somehow treat Markdown on your file system like an API. You can do that with Nuxt content. So we could create a folder called content, create a folder called articles, and we could have article 1, we could have article 2, let's give them some front matter. And do that for both of them. And in a Nuxt component, you would then be able to say pull that in. So if we were to use fetch, we could say it's as simple as that. So we now have this thing called articles, and we're going to say to do an articles, forgive that, to do.title. And we now should have the titles from those articles. And you could do the same with body, content. You can embed Vue components, all kinds of other cool things. But I'm aware I may be going down the rabbit hole, and I'm sure my time is coming up. But Alistair's going to have to rein me in because I'll totally go on forever.
I can listen to you forever, so like we're in a bit of a problem here. But that's brilliant. Thank you, Daniel. Sorry, what was it that you said about Cloudinary? What's Cloudinary?
So, the Nuxt image module has a number of providers built in. So Cloudinary is one of those. Cloudinary is a service that is effectively digital asset management. It will store your images for you. You can request them in different sizes. You can actually perform transformations on them, cropping, all done through the URL that you request. And the same is true with all these other providers as well. So Fastly and ImageKit and ImageX and Netlify has one, and Prismic and Sanity and stuff. And so there's lots of providers, people that do that. And Nuxt Image basically integrates with that. So all I would need to do is pass some configuration. And I think Cloudinary has a couple of options that I need to provide. So I need to give them a base URL, which matches my, my account. And that's all I would need to do. And then at that point, I would be pulling in data from Cloudinary rather than from my project.
Gotcha. And so that's why you need that to be at runtime at that point, because obviously you don't want to be statically serving that. Right. That
exactly. That would be it at runtime. If I don't have a provider and I have a server, it's going to dynamically resize it at runtime for me. It's going to inject a server handler called this IPX handler, which you may have seen _IPX image1.jpg, and you can see I'm just pulling the headers in. My shell being too smart for me. If I'm just pulling the headers in, you can see it's returning an image, a JPEG. So it's actually doing that live, and it's creating my own image resizing serverless function for me. So I can deploy with that to a server, or if I actually just generate the app, it will resize the image, all the images that I need in all the different sizes that I need, so that they can be pulled smartly by the browser. But obviously, if you have got a lot of images, generating them at build time might not be the way to go. So often it can be really better to do that at runtime, because then you have your runtime provider, your digital asset provider, caching them for you and handling all the specialized work that they need to do. But you'll see, if I have a look in my Nuxt images, I've produced the 2 different sizes of image that we want. So
brilliant. Thanks so much, Daniel. There have been no specific questions in the chat, except the ones that I asked. Just before I get to yours, Horace, I wanted to just pick up on something Tam said, which I thought was really interesting, which was how Nuxt would play with Ionic that Phil mentioned earlier. Have you seen any projects that are using those two together?
I have. So the first place always to start, by the way, is modules. The Nuxt modules list, which is not exhaustive, by the way. There are others. And so so Ionic has a number of parts to it. One of the parts, this isn't Ionic per se, but it depends why you're using Ionic. So I've integrated Nuxt with capacitor before. Nuxt, so there are a number of basically Vue components that can be used in Nuxt from Ionic. But my own experience is using capacitor, which is produced by the same people as Ionic.
Sorry, I was muted. Great stuff. Thanks. I think we've got a few questions from Horace, but Zoom has done something weird in the chat, so I'll try and ask them as best as I can. Right. So how would you do roots with arbitrary numbers of nesting levels, like /slug1, /slug2, etc.? Is that something?
It's possible. So obviously you. So effectively, we don't know how many slugs something might have. So in this case, I'll fire up the dev server again. In this case, if I were just to swap out the underscore ID, which matches a single parameter called ID, with something which is a single underscore only, that's basically our wildcard catch-all root. So in this case, I would say, let's just display what this $root thing is a way of accessing the view router root. So if I were to say, I would like to know the params, and we're just going to stringify those so we can see them. And that's to-dos, whatever. So you'll see that what's coming up here is, rather than a named parameter, we're getting test another root as our parameter for path match. And the way that's turning up in the view router configuration is using the star, the wildcard root. So that will match any number of slashes beyond that point.
Very cool. I hope that answered your question, Horace. He's also asking if you have any comments about Jamstack and incremental builds.
Jamstack and what?
Sorry, incremental builds.
Yeah. So Jamstack, I think, is an incredibly powerful model. I guess we may all be interested or converted at this point. I would say if you can get away with statically generating your app, that's best. The more things you can move to edge nodes, the better. Better experience for users, they cache better, and you're able to stay in control of your build process. So the Nuxt3 rendering engine, this thing called Nitro, which I could actually demo for you if you're really interested, is basically enables incremental builds. So a lot of that is dependent on the provider. So how they offer that, because so what are you saying when you're talking about an incremental build? There is an initial build phase, right? So we create the app, we create the server, but then what happens when you request, say, in this case, we have got an arbitrary matching pattern. We can't generate all of that in advance. So the typical pattern with a static app is to create a rule which matches any unmatched root to a fallback page, which just loads a normal Vue SPA app, which handles that. Is this a matched root? Then it sort of figures out, okay, it should be rendered with underscore.view. What are we going to do? We're going to do that from scratch in the browser. But that doesn't cache, right? So that's being done by every person's browser all the time. So with incremental static regeneration, what we do, what we do is we say, the server is going to render that single root, and then it's going to cache it and remember it from now on. So that procedure is basically very dependent on the provider. So Netlify have something called distributed persistent rendering, which they've just released. Vercel have a feature which is probably what you'll be familiar with from Next.js running on Vercel, which is incremental static generation. Nitro supports that. So when that comes out, you'll be able to see that in action. But it is highly dependent on the provider, because what has to happen is it has to hit a server endpoint. Nuxt has to generate that root, and then the provider has to cache and save that root. So all future visits to it get rendered, that HTML rendered. So it's
brilliant. Thanks, man. Like we've got a couple more questions from Horace, but does anyone want to come off mute? Are there any other questions that anyone wanted to ask before I ask those? No? Okay, cool. So Horace is also asking if in Nux 3 they'll combine async data and fetch into one thing. Do you know if that's going to be the case?
Yes, that is the case. So in Nux 3, so at the moment, so Horace, clearly you know Nux because I haven't even mentioned async data. So async data is it's basically an asynchronous function, the output of which gets merged with your data. So in Vue, you start your component off with some data. But what if you need to perform some kind of fetch, as we were doing in the index page? You could use the fetch that I've done here. The thing about that is it's done synchronously on server side, but if you're navigating from on the client side and you haven't generated your app in advance, then that's going to happen as you navigate. So it's not going to block the page navigation. What async data does, it only works for pages because it has to use view router hooks to make this work. But it actually blocks navigation to the next page until that data fetching has happened, which means you can render a fully rendered view, which has all the data it needs to render. So you don't ever have a loading, you don't ever have to have a loading state if you're using async data. Often that's great. Sometimes it is better to display a loading state because it can feel snappier to the user. They click the button and it instantly changed and there's still a loading and then everything is there, rather than clicking a button and they wait a second and then everything is there. So it depends on your app. With Nux 3, yes, there's going to be a new function, which there's a new async data basically, which has both blocking and non-blocking implementations. So you can basically block page navigation if you need to, or you can have a more fetch-like behavior. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Daniel. We've had a question about Nitro. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Nitro is, so it's a when I say a rendering engine, it's the thing that transforms a request into HTML. So it decides what's coming back when you ask for a page. It's a server. So there are a number of features about it, but it's basically optimized for today's serverless world. So rather than having a big monolithic server, which sits in memory for a long period of time and has to be optimized to take lots and lots of different requests and return them, return them correctly and so on, but can rely on there being lots of stuff in known modules. It can rely on having a whole operating system around it. It can rely on all these sorts of things. More and more, we need to be able to produce tight, lean, minimal builds that have nothing more than is necessary. So Nitro is reinventing the server for Nuxt. So we've mocked lots of Node APIs so that Nitro isn't dependent on Node. And in fact, lots of libraries that people might use that wrap Node or add extra fluff, we mock them throughout your dependency tree to get rid of them. And Nitro then is able to respond to incoming requests. At its core, and this may be getting into too much detail, so please, honestly, feel free to yawn or whatever. But at its core, Nitro is almost a telephone exchange. So your request comes in, and Nitro knows whether it can handle that or not. So if it matches that request, then it will lazy load the JavaScript that's needed to respond to that request. So there's not a sort of sense of everything is always loaded. We're optimizing for fast cold start times. So there's this tiny exchange router that basically decides whether or not we can respond to something, lazy loads the code that's necessary to respond, and then responds to it. It's got some cool features. So for example, within your app, you can fetch data from other bits of your app. So if you were in your index.view file and you needed to fetch from your own API endpoint, you could do that without causing another network request. Nitro would intercept that request, know that it could handle it itself, and just call the function that is necessary to return the response. So you get this incredibly fast response for bits of your app. Nitro works on Versal and Netlify and Azure and AWS Lambda and Cloudflare Workers. It works everywhere basically, which is our effort to move things to the edge. That's not to say that you should always use Nitro. I mean, if you can get away with a static site and pre-built HTML, then do that, because that's always going to trump a server. But Nitro is as close as we can get to making a server as lean and light as possible.
Very interesting. Thanks, Daniel. I'm just gonna take sort of one or two more questions because time marches on. Daniel van Bazen is asking if there's a built-in testing library.
So there's not a built-in testing library, no. You can use Vue test utils to test your components. Oh, I didn't even tell you about components. I can't believe that. Well, Alistair, you said this is the last question. I'm going to take full advantage of that. So you can use Vue, but I will try and answer the question as well. So you can use Vue test utils to test your components, just as you normally would in a Vue app. And there is also a library that we're just putting together called Nuxt test utils that lets you test things that rely on the framework. So stuff like the fetch hook. Vue isn't going to do anything with that. That's not a Vue hook. So if you're trying to test its behavior, you're not going to be able to do that with Vue. But we provide this Nuxt test utils library that lets you just simulate a request in your test. Say, I want the page for / about, and Nuxt will then do everything that it would normally do. So load the plugins, load in the modules, whatever is required, register all the components, and give you a response. And you can then either interact with that in the browser in a Playwright instance, or you can also interact with that in a Node instance and just inspect the HTML and do whatever you need to do with that. So it's basically more of an end-to-end framework. The thing that I should have mentioned is that Nuxt has this really powerful feature, which is the components folder. So if you create a component and I'm so imaginative of my components, right? If you create a component and then you just want to, we'll call it something else, about item, and then you want to use that elsewhere in your project, you don't need to import it. You can just use it straight away, and Nuxt will learn that it will know that it's not going to import it globally. It will know that it's needed to be imported only in that file, and it will actually import it for you. So about component is there, and then when you build the app, it actually puts those imports in the right places. So it's super from a development ergonomics point of view.